Is Mr. Morgan sitting down now? Is he there? Yes. Okay, great. Hello, my name is Emma Alman. I'm a high school senior at KIS International School. I'm really nervous, and I'll be surprised if my speech isn't a little shaky, so sorry about that in advance. Anyway, this event's theme is change, so I'm going to talk about how change can happen. I think that it's easier to think about things on the small scale and expand outwards, so I'm going to look at change in the frame of the LGBT community. LGBT, for clarification, is not a sandwich. It's an acronym where L stands for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, and T for transgender. There is usually a whole slew of other letters after those, but I really don't know enough to do them any justice, so I'm just going to overlook them for now. Before we entrench ourselves in the particulars of the community and why change in the LGBT community make a good match, I'd like to tell you a story to provide some context. The year I turned 9 years old, my family and I bounced between 7 houses. It felt like we were moving every other week. We lost 2 whole cats and probably broke at least an entire set of dinner plates. And yeah, sure, occasionally I had my own room, and once we ended up in a house with a yard at least as big as a football field. But I loved my cats more than I loved my personal space, a potential case of Stockholm Syndrome. And we were in that house with a big yard for like 2 months before we had to haul off in the middle of the night. We did eventually stagger to a momentary halt in Texas, but by then my opinion of change had soured so completely that I was resistant even to the smallest changes in my routine. This was because, at 9 years old, every change felt so agonizingly monumental that I was sure that's how change was supposed to be. Change was, at the default, a horrible ordeal you had to slog through. Of course, despite my newfound loathing of all things non-sedentary, my family and I moved to Kiev, Ukraine 2 years later. And I had never even heard of Ukraine. Thanks, American-centric geographical education. I couldn't make heads or tails of Russian, and half my extended family was positive I was going to come back a communist. We had to ditch 3 whole cats, again, and half of everything we owned. We arrived in the dead of night to what might as well have been the moon for all the places I'd been, and I thought moving from one county to another was painful. The me right now loves Ukraine, but 12-year-old me was unconvinced. Even the whole snow in the winter thing was novel for a hot minute, before we realized that Texas had us woefully unprepared for that nonsense. I met people from all over the world, but I was so culture shocked by the notion that it seemed endlessly difficult instead of wondrous and new. I had no intention of letting things in my life change ever again when I came to Ukraine. By the way, the minute you decide that something is never, ever going to happen to you again, you may as well ask the universe for the kick in the pants that's headed your way. I wanted to continue stomping through life with my eyes closed and avoid all things new and potentially change-inducing. Something was bound to give. And of course it did, right about when I turned 13. Puberty, am I right? I was cruising along, enduring what most prepubescents do, acne, body odor, unfortunately not growth spurts. And oh hey, I was gay. Of course, I am still gay, and that is something of a problem. Not my problem. I'm gay, and that's more or less the end of things on my end. But it's not all rainbows and sunshine if you're here and you're queer. I mean, I'm proud to be a member of the LGBT community. Communities are great. They put a bunch of like people under the same umbrella, a rainbow umbrella, so they can hang out with similar people with similar interests. Problem is, when you put a bunch of people all together, it makes them a much easier target. And LGBT folks are definitely akin to punching bags in the global community. We could look, for instance, at how they're treated right here in Ukraine. Every country that enters into an agreement with the European Union, trade-related or otherwise, has to meet a few conditions. The folding of certain pre-existing laws into their justice system, for instance. Among those are laws which prevent the discrimination of minority groups, which includes LGBT folks. The EU is pretty strict about these things, with a sort of accept these conditions or find another trade union kind of attitude. A list of countries who have folded such laws into their own includes Georgia, Albania, Serbia, Mexico, and even Iraq, but not Ukraine. So cultural sensitivities and even religious proclivities are put by the roadside when it comes to the EU's trade agreements and political agreements. But Ukraine was an exception to the rule, for the sake of encouraging Ukraine to enter into the agreement and make governmental transition a little easier. Now knowing what the climate for LGBT folks is in a country which could even be considered tame in comparison to other countries like, say, Nigeria, where I'd have been sentenced to death by now, it hopefully is understandable that I'd like to shake things up a little. Which brings me back to the overarching topic of this talk, change. I'm of the opinion that how we think about change is not always conducive to progress. We like to talk about change in uncomfortably broad terms, burdened by connotation. It's heroic and triumphant, or it's agonizing but awe-inspiring. Always, though, it's big. Change has got to be big and exciting and important. The year I was 9 and moving all over the place, I hated change with a burning passion, to the point that I began to hate the idea of change. I thought that because the changes that had happened in my life had all seemed so colossal that all change afterwards was going to be just as horrific. I even expected some earth-shaking change when I stumbled over my sexuality. Nothing was ever going to be the same. I figured that the next day I was going to get up, go to school, and somehow everyone would know. As it turns out, life just goes on. I got dressed the next morning, I went to my classes, struggled through math, ate a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and the whole time I was gay, and doing the same stuff I always do. There weren't any extra rainbows or glitter involved. And that awkward juxtaposition of that frightened fantasy and the really mundane reality helped me understand that we're thinking of we're thinking of change like it's a mountain, when really it's a molehill, which is that little pile of dirt you get when moles poke their heads up above ground. They're small and mountains are big, is what I'm getting at. And if we're assuming that molehills are mountains, nothing is getting done. The thing about change is that it rarely ever starts out as more than a molehill, or really as one mole. One person who gets to thinking, or makes one unintentional, or perhaps even deliberate shift in routine, or diet, or behavior. It doesn't immediately feel like anything has happened. Moles aren't usually aware that they're moles in the first place. But they do what they do, and they leave a molehill behind. Maybe your molehill is saying hello to that quiet girl in class, or trying a new sugar-free diet for a while. It's going to be uninteresting and run-of-the-mill, but that's just the beginning. I'm the mole, and gay rights are my molehill. And of course, things have started to change, little by little. I got comfortable expressing myself in ways I thought would be incriminating before. I cut my hair short, and wear masculine clothes. And I've taken a few blows in consequence. But it's still nothing like the mountain I had thought it would be when I was 13. I had a horror story all mapped out in my head. Getting lynched, never finding a loyal or loving partner, and never being able to build a family. Because change is supposed to be agonizing, big, and exciting, and important. Because that's easy. It's easy to think that one thing happens and it builds and builds and builds all on its own to something remarkable because of that one initial action. We think of change like some sort of inertia. We implement that initial push and sit back and watch the rest happen. And of course that's how we want change to work. I wish I could give this speech and let it snowball out of control while I look on and maybe in a year's time, LGBT rights will have improved. But that's just pretty thinking, and it's not going to get me to the places I want to be. The trouble is that we can't change the world. A molehill isn't a mountain. Sometimes it feels like a mountain. I have people I love who will watch this video, and our relationship is going to change because of what I've said here today. It feels like a mountain. But for all the enormity, it only really matters that much to me for now. We all have people and things in our lives that we can reach out and change right then and there. These are our spheres of influence. And I'll reach out to everyone I can, even if it feels big, even if it hurts. Despite my best efforts, though, I can only reach so many people. I have a relatively small sphere of influence. And no one in this room, has a sphere of influence big enough that they alone could make the monumental change we all like to think about. Instead, we have to content ourselves with making molehills, which isn't as bad as it seems. It's not as though molehills can't become mountains, but making molehills into mountains is hard work. It's arduous and tedious. It takes integrity and endurance. It takes wherewithal and patience, and a heap of other synonymous SAT words. But more than anything, it takes commitment. We have to make our molehill into a mountain. And not everybody likes to think that your molehill deserves to be a mountain. And that's why it's a molehill in the first place. That's where the grit comes in. It's going to start unremarkable, unattractive, and so small you can barely tell it's there. You have to pack dirt into that little molehill until you've got something that passes for a mountain. And you might have to drag all your friends to come and see what you've made. It's not going to be easy, and it might take a while, but it can be done. I think that if more people could face the music and start approaching change with molehills in mind, we'd get a lot more done. That's not to say there's not a lot being done. Gay rights are on the up and up, and we've seen right here in Ukraine what happens when somebody turns some other molehill into a mountain. And not one of those protesters in Maidan sat down, did their bit, and waited for the ripple effect to do the rest. They hunkered down, and they started packing in dirt every way they could. They called friends, they rented billboards, and they raised a stink about unfair government where everybody could see. They wanted something to happen, and they made it happen. They made it a big deal. They made that molehill a mountain. It's easy to feel defeatist when you think this way. I'm just making little changes, look at my sad little molehill. Or to feel like you're not making enough of a difference, so you might as well not make one at all. The world is too big, and I'm too small. Why try to make something happen when it's so hard? That was definitely me, like 3 years ago. But the LGBT community here needs that kind of change. And I'm not a networking, speech-giving kind of gal usually, but I'm willing to get on a stage in front of a sea of almost strangers because gay rights, my rights, matter to me. They matter enough that I'm willing to do just about anything that I can do to make things a little bit better. Real change is a lot less stoicism and heroic suffering and a lot more networking and shameless slogging through the mud. But if it matters, if it's worth doing, then it's worth the tedious task of piling the effort up and up and up until your molehill is a mountain. Thank you.